The moment my boyfriend told me he was spending another summer vacation alone with the woman he used to love, I finally stopped fighting for our relationship. Looking back, that should have broken my heart. Instead, it brought me something I hadn't felt in a very long time: relief. Ryan was sitting across from me at our favorite restaurant when he casually dropped the news. We had just ordered dessert. We had spent the evening discussing work, future plans, and whether we should start looking for a bigger apartment next year. Everything had felt normal, stable, comfortable. Then he glanced at his phone and smiled. "Sophie's already booking the cabin for July," he said. "Looks like the lake house is available again this year." I stared at him. "The two of you are going again?" He looked confused by the question. "Of course. We go every year." For a few seconds, I simply looked at the man I had loved for the past 3 years. 3 years. 3 birthdays. 3 Christmases. 3 anniversaries. 3 years of trying to convince myself that what bothered me wasn't a big deal. 3 years of being understanding. 3 years of communicating calmly. 3 years of hearing the same answer every single time. "You're overthinking it, Emma. She's just my best friend. Nothing is happening." I knew Sophie. I'd met her dozens of times. She wasn't a bad person. She wasn't secretly trying to steal my boyfriend. She was engaged to Daniel, a genuinely kind man who adored her. Sophie and Ryan had been friends since college. Ryan had even admitted early in our relationship that he'd once had feelings for her. It was years ago. He told me she didn't feel the same way, and I moved on. At the time, I appreciated his honesty. I thought honesty was a good foundation for a relationship. What I hadn't understood was that moving on and letting go weren't always the same thing. "Emma," Ryan said, "why are you looking at me like that?" I took a sip of water before answering. "Ryan, don't you think it's a little strange?" He sighed immediately. That sigh. I have come to hate that sigh. It was the sigh he made whenever I brought up something he didn't want to discuss. The sigh that said, "Here we go again." "What exactly is strange?" he asked. "A week-long vacation. Just the two of you. We've done it every year." "I know. Nothing has ever happened." "I know. So what's the problem?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after 3 years, we were still having the exact same conversation. "Ryan," I said carefully, "I've never accused you of cheating." "But no, let me finish." He leaned back in his chair. "Fine. I've never accused you of being unfaithful. I've never told you to stop being friends with Sophie. I've never asked you to choose between us." "Then what are you asking?" I looked directly at him. "I'm asking whether you think it's appropriate." "Appropriate? You're 30 years old. She's engaged. You're in a serious relationship. You're talking about marriage with me. Yet, every summer, the two of you disappear for a week together." Ryan rubbed his forehead. "It's not romantic." I didn't say it was. "Then why does it matter?" Because I was tired. Tired of explaining something that should have been obvious. Tired of feeling like the villain for wanting boundaries. Tired of pretending that being endlessly understanding was the same thing as being respected. "It matters because relationships change," I said quietly. "Friendships change. Priorities change. Sophie's family to me. And what am I?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Ryan looked surprised. "Emma, you know you're important to me." Important. Not first. Not a priority. Important. There was a difference. I suddenly remembered all the moments I'd spent ignoring. The dinner Ryan left halfway through because Sophie had a fight with Daniel and needed someone to talk to. The weekend getaway we canceled because Sophie needed help moving apartments. The countless late-night calls. The endless inside jokes. The way everyone assumed Sophie would automatically be included whenever Ryan talked about major life events. Individually, none of those moments seemed significant. Together, they painted a picture I had been trying not to see. I looked at Ryan and realized something painful. Sophie wasn't his girlfriend, but she occupied a space in his life that no friend should occupy when you're building a future with someone else. "You're quiet," Brian said. "I'm thinking about what?" About how exhausted I was. About how many conversations we'd already had. About how every single one ended with me being the one expected to compromise. "Can I ask you a question?" I said. "Sure. If Sophie asked you not to go on this trip, what would you do?" Ryan answered instantly. "I'd cancel." There wasn't even a second of hesitation. Not one. Why? I asked. Because if she was uncomfortable, I'd want to understand why. I felt something inside me go very still. I see. Ryan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. Surprisingly, I felt calm. Calmer than I had felt in months. Can I ask another question? Okay, if I asked you not to go this time. He hesitated. It wasn't a long hesitation. Maybe 2 seconds, 3 at most, but it was there long enough. Long enough for me to see him searching for the right answer. Long enough for me to know exactly where I stood. Emma, that's different. And there it was. The answer. The truth. The thing we'd both been dancing around for years. Different. Sophie deserved understanding. Sophie deserved consideration. Sophie deserved accommodation. Me. I was expected to understand. Always understand. Always be patient. Always be mature enough to accept things that made me uncomfortable. I smiled, not because I was happy, because suddenly everything made sense. You're right, I said softly. It is different. Ryan relaxed slightly, apparently thinking we'd reached an agreement. Exactly. That's the problem. His expression changed. What? I pushed my chair back from the table. Emma, the 3 years I've been trying to explain how this feels. You're overreacting. I laughed then. A small, tired laugh. You know what's funny? What? I don't think you've ever actually listened to me. Of course I've listened. No. I shook my head. You've heard me. That's not the same thing. Ryan's face hardened. So what? You're breaking up with me over a vacation. No. I stood and picked up my purse. I'm breaking up with you because after 3 years together, you still don't understand why the vacation matters. The color drained from his face. Wait. Goodbye. Ryan. Emma. Stop. For the first time, panic entered his voice. But strangely, it didn't affect me. Maybe because this wasn't a sudden decision. It was the result of 1,000 tiny disappointments. 1,000 moments of feeling second place. 1,000 conversations that led nowhere. You're seriously ending things? He asked. I looked at him one last time. At the man I had loved. At the man who never cheated, never lied, never betrayed me in any obvious way, and yet somehow still made me feel alone. Ryan, I said gently, the saddest part is that I don't think you even realize why. Then I turned and walked away. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't wondering whether I was asking for too much. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't questioning my own feelings. For the first time in 3 years, I chose myself. And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I realized something unexpected. Losing Ryan wasn't what hurt. Realizing how long I had settled for less than I deserved it. Chapter 2. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and stared at the ceiling, waiting for the heartbreak to arrive. Everyone always talked about breakups as if they were earthquakes. Sudden, devastating, impossible to ignore. I expected to feel shattered. Instead, I felt quiet, not happy, not relieved enough to smile, just quiet, like a room after a storm had finally passed. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Ryan, 3 missed calls, 2 text messages. Emma, let's talk. Then another. You're upset right now. Let's discuss this when you've calmed down. I stared at the screen for a moment before setting it face down. There it was again. The assumption that this was an emotional reaction, that I was angry, that if he just waited long enough, I would realize I'd overreacted and come back. What Ryan didn't understand was that the breakup wasn't the impulsive part. Staying had been. I had spent 3 years convincing myself that patience would eventually solve a problem that respect was supposed to solve. 3 years telling myself that because nothing inappropriate was happening, I shouldn't feel uncomfortable. 3 years trying to be understanding while quietly hoping he would someday understand me too. The breakup had taken 5 minutes. The decision had taken years. Half an hour later, the door called. Miss Carter, there's someone here asking for you. I already knew who it was. Ryan. Yes. I walked to the window and looked down. Sure enough, he was standing outside the building with his hands in his pockets. He didn't look heartbroken. He looked frustrated, like someone dealing with an unexpected inconvenience. Tell him I'm not available. A few minutes later, the doorman called again. He says it's important. I sighed. Of course. He did. Everything was important now that it was affecting him. I'm still not available. I closed the curtain and made myself breakfast. My phone rang a few minutes later. Ryan was calling from his work number. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, Emma. The relief in his voice was immediate. Thank God. I leaned against the kitchen counter. What do you want? Ryan, can we talk? We're talking. You know what I mean. I poured myself a cup of coffee. Say what you need to say. There was a brief pause before he spoke. I think you're making a mistake. Not I miss you. Not I understand. Not let's work through this. A mistake. Do you? I asked calmly. Yes. His voice grew firmer. You can't throw away 3 years over vacation. I looked out the window. The vacation isn't why I left. Then what is? I closed my eyes. Somehow that question hurt more than anything else because, after everything, he still didn't know. You really don't understand? I asked. No. He sounded genuinely confused. And that was the problem. Ryan wasn't pretending not to understand. He truly didn't because every time I brought up my concerns, he'd been so focused on defending himself that he'd never listened. Ryan, have you ever considered that this was never about Sophie? Silence. What do you mean? I mean, Sophie isn't the issue. Then who is you? Another silence followed longer this time. That's unfair. Is it? I've never cheated on you. I know. I've never done anything with Sophie. I know. His frustration was growing. Then why are we even having this conversation? I laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because somehow he still thought fidelity was the only standard that mattered. Ryan, relationships aren't measured by cheating alone. Then what are they measured by? Priority. The word landed between us. What priority? I repeated. Who comes first? Who gets considered? Who gets protected? Who gets listened to? Emma, you're acting like I don't care about you. No, I'm acting like caring about someone isn't the same thing as prioritizing them. He exhaled sharply. That's ridiculous, is it? I took a sip of coffee. Let me ask you something. Fine. Name one boundary you've ever created with Sophie. Because I told you I was uncomfortable. Silence. One boundary. Ryan. Nothing. Anything. He didn't answer because there wasn't an answer. Sophie still called late at night. Sophie still came first during emergencies. Sophie still had private vacations with him. Sophie still occupied a place in his life that remained untouched by any concerns. I raised not because he loved her romantically, because he never believed there was a reason to change anything. Eventually, Ryan spoke. That's different. I smiled sadly. There it was, the word that had followed us throughout our entire relationship, different. Every concern I raised was different. Every boundary was different. Every uncomfortable situation was different. Different enough to dismiss. Never important enough to address. Goodbye, Ryan. Emma. Wait. No. My voice remained calm. I spent 3 years waiting for you to understand me. I'm done waiting. You're being stubborn. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. When communication failed, I became stubborn. When patience ran out, I became unreasonable. When I finally left, I became impulsive. Somehow accountability never entered the conversation. Take care of yourself, Ryan. Then I ended the call. A few seconds later, I blocked his number. Not because I hated him. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for the first time in 3 years, I wanted peace. The following weeks felt strangely light. I packed away photographs, returned his spare key, removed his name from shared reservations, divided belongings, handled every practical detail with the same calm certainty I felt inside. Friends kept waiting for me to fall apart. Instead, I started sleeping better. My anxiety disappeared. The constant pressure of trying to make someone understand what they didn't want to understand slowly faded. One evening, my best friend, Maya, finally asked the question everyone else had been avoiding. Do you miss him? I thought about it carefully before answering sometimes. Then why do you seem so okay? I smiled. Because I don't miss the relationship as much as I miss the person. May frowned. What's the difference? I looked out the cafe window. The relationship was exhausting. For years, I'd carried responsibilities that weren't mine. I'd been the one adjusting, the one compromising, the one understanding, the one explaining, the one giving second chances. Loving Ryan had never been the hard part. Being with him had been, and for the first time since we'd met, I no longer had to convince myself that my feelings were reasonable. I already knew they were. That certainty felt better than any apology Ryan could have given me. And somewhere deep down, I had a feeling that eventually he would understand everything I'd been trying to tell him. The problem was that by the time he did, it would be too late. Chapter 3. 3 months after the breakup, I got promoted. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning during a quarterly meeting I had almost forgotten about. My director announced it in front of the entire department, and for a moment, I simply sat there staring at her while everyone around me applauded. 6 months ago, I would have immediately called Ryan. He would have been the first person I told, the first person whose opinion mattered, the first person I wanted to celebrate with. Instead, I found myself smiling as my coworkers dragged me out for lunch and insisted on ordering far too much food. Surprisingly, the thought didn't make me sad. It simply reminded me how much my life had changed, because for the first time in years, my happiness didn't feel dependent on someone else's presence. That afternoon, as I sat alone in my new office, I realized something unexpected. During the entire morning, I hadn't thought about Ryan once. Not until that moment. Not when I received the promotion. Not when my friends congratulated me. Not when my mother called, crying happy tears. The realization startled me. There had been a time when Ryan occupied so much space in my mind that I measured every achievement against whether I could share it with him. Now entire days passed without him crossing my thoughts. Healing apparently wasn't dramatic. It happened quietly, one ordinary day at a time. That evening, Maya came over with takeout and immediately claimed the couch as if she owned the apartment. "So," she said, opening a container of noodles, "have you heard the latest?" I laughed. "Latest what?" "Latest Ryan drama." I rolled my eyes. "I don't want Ryan drama." "Too bad." She grinned. "Apparently, he and Sophie are on their annual vacation right now." I paused. "Oh, that's all. What do you want me to say?" Maya studied me carefully. "Nothing." I guess the truth was that hearing about the vacation no longer hurt. If anything, it confirmed I had made the right decision because 3 months had passed, and despite losing a 3-year relationship, Ryan had still gone on the trip. The trip he'd insisted wasn't important. The trip he'd refused to reconsider. The trip he'd chosen over listening to me. If he was still taking it, then clearly he'd never understood the problem. Maya leaned back against the couch. Apparently, Daniel showed up. That caught my attention. Sophie's fiancé. Yep. Wasn't he supposed to be working? No idea. She shrugged. But from what I heard, something happened. What happened? Maya's smile widened. Now you're interested. Maya. Fine. She laughed. Apparently, there was some kind of argument. I frowned. About what? No clue. She pointed her chopsticks at me. But one of Sophie's friends mentioned that Daniel finally got tired of something. I didn't think much of it afterward. Whatever happened on their vacation had nothing to do with me anymore. At least that's what I told myself. 3 days later, I was having dinner with my parents when my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I almost ignored it. Then curiosity got the better of me. The message was short. "Hi, Emma. It's Sophie. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but could we talk?" I stared at the screen. My mother noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" "I think so." I put the phone down. Just an unexpected message. I didn't respond that night, or the next morning, or even the day after that, because honestly, I wasn't sure what Sophie and I had left to discuss. She wasn't the reason Ryan and I broke up. Not really. The problem had always been Ryan. But eventually another message arrived. "Please, I owe you an apology." That one surprised me. An apology for what? After staring at the text for several minutes, I finally replied, "Okay, coffee on Saturday." Her response arrived almost instantly. "Thanks." Saturday came sooner than expected. When I arrived at the cafe, Sophie was already there. The moment I saw her, I knew something was different. She looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Hi," she said quietly as I sat down. "Hi." An awkward silence followed. Then Sophie surprised me again. I'm sorry. I blinked. For what? She laughed bitterly. Honestly, more things than I realized. I waited. Sophie took a deep breath. Daniel postponed our wedding. The word stunned me. What? 2 weeks ago. I stared at her. Why? She looked down at her coffee cup. Because of Ryan. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie continued. Not because he thinks we're having an affair. Then why? Her eyes filled with embarrassment. Because he thinks our friendship has unhealthy boundaries. I almost laughed at the irony. Not because it was funny. Because for 3 years I'd been told I was overreacting. Too sensitive. Too insecure. Yet now Daniel had apparently reached the exact same conclusion. Sophie noticed my expression and winced. Yeah, I didn't say anything. Sophie looked miserable enough already. Daniel asked me a question during the vacation. She swallowed. He asked if Ryan called on our wedding day and needed me. Would I leave to help him? I frowned, and I didn't know how to answer. The admission hung heavily between us. Then, he asked Ryan if he'd be okay with his girlfriend taking yearly vacations alone with a man who used to love her. She laughed bitterly. Ryan immediately said no. I looked away. Somehow that didn't surprise me at all. Daniel said something that I can't stop thinking about. Sophie's voice softened. He said neither of us cheated. We just kept expecting our partners to accept things we'd never accept ourselves. I remained silent because there was nothing to add. Sophie looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Emma, I genuinely thought you were okay with everything. I wasn't. I know that now. Her voice cracked slightly. The worst part is that you told us, over and over. I remembered every conversation, every calm explanation, every attempt to communicate, every dismissal. Ryan never listened. I said quietly. Sophie shook her head. Neither did I. For the first time since we'd sat down. I felt sorry for her. Not because her wedding was postponed. Because she was finally experiencing what it felt like when someone you love repeatedly ignores your concerns. Sophie wiped her eyes. Daniel told me he won't marry me until things change. What are you going to do? She gave a sad smile. Learn boundaries. Apparently. Then her expression became serious. Emma, what? You were right. The words landed softly, not triumphant, not satisfying, just sad, because being right had cost me a relationship. Sophie looked away. I wish we'd listened sooner. I thought about that for a moment. Then I shook my head. No, you couldn't have listened sooner. She frowned. Why? I smiled sadly. Because if either of you were capable of listening sooner, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie nodded slowly because deep down she knew I was right. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, Ryan was probably beginning to realize it, too. The difference was that Daniel had given Sophie another chance. I hadn't given Ryan one, and I wasn't going to. Chapter 4. 6 months after our breakup. Ryan finally understood what I had been trying to tell him. Unfortunately for him, he understood it from someone else. I learned that much later. Of course, at the time, I was too busy living my life to think much about him. My weekends were no longer spent negotiating around someone else's priorities. My evenings were peaceful. My apartment finally felt like home. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling for no reason at all. And every time it happened, I felt a little guilty, as if I should have been sadder after losing a 3-year relationship. But the truth was simple. The relationship had ended long before the breakup. The breakup had simply made it official. One Friday evening, I was having dinner with Maya when she nearly dropped her phone onto the table. You are not going to believe this. I looked up from my pastor. Believe what? Ryan called me. That got my attention. Why would Ryan call you? Because apparently he can't call you. I laughed. Good observation. Maya stared at her phone. Emma, I think he's having a breakdown. That's unfortunate. You're cold. No. I took another bite. I'm healed. Maya rolled her eyes. Anyway, he asked if I thought you'd ever take him back. I nearly choked on my drink. What? Those were his exact words. And what did you say? Maya smiled. I told him no. Thank you. You're welcome. Then she leaned forward. Apparently, a lot has happened. Despite myself, curiosity surfaced, such as Maya lowered her voice dramatically. Daniel postponed the wedding for 4 months. I already knew that. Sophie had told me. Okay. And Ryan spent those 4 months watching Daniel actually enforce boundaries. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Apparently, Daniel wasn't joking. Maya scrolled through her messages. No more private vacations. No more dropping everything for Ryan. No more late night emotional support calls. No more treating Ryan like the most important man in Sophie's life. I stared at her, really, for a moment. I imagined Ryan experiencing what I'd felt for years, watching someone else's priorities shift, realizing he no longer occupied the same place in their life, feeling the distance, feeling the boundaries, feeling what it was like to become second. Not because someone stopped caring, because someone finally put their partner first. Maya continued. According to Ryan, he hated it. I laughed before I could stop myself. I bet he did. Apparently, Sophie stopped answering calls during date nights with Daniel. Normal. Apparently, she stopped sharing every detail of her life with Ryan first. Also normal. Apparently, she started checking with Daniel before making plans. Extremely normal. Maya pointed at me. Exactly. But Ryan said everything felt different. I leaned back in my chair. Of course, it felt different because, for the first time, he wasn't receiving the kind of priority he'd spent years taking for granted. Maya shook her head. You know what finally got him? What? The wedding invitations. I frowned. The wedding invitations. Apparently, Sophie asked Daniel to help choose them. Okay. Maya laughed. Ryan found out afterward. Suddenly, I understood. For years, Ryan had been Sophie's automatic first call. The first opinion. The first consultation. The first person included. Then one day he wasn't, and it hurt. He called Daniel. I guessed. Yep. Maya grinned, and Daniel basically told him, Congratulations. You've discovered boundaries. I couldn't help laughing. Not because I enjoyed Ryan's pain, because the irony was almost unbelievable. Ryan had spent years dismissing concerns he never expected to experience himself. Then life handed him the same lesson from the opposite side. Maya's smile faded slightly. Apparently, he finally admitted, You were right. I looked down at my glass. Did he? According to Sophie, a strange feeling passed through me. Not satisfaction, not victory, just sadness. Because this was exactly what I'd wanted all along. Not the apology, not the regret, the understanding. I had spent years trying to help him see something that now seemed obvious to him. And yet, it took losing me for him to learn it. Maya watched me carefully. How do you feel? I considered the question. Honestly, yeah, nothing. She blinked. Nothing. And it was true. 6 months earlier, hearing that Ryan finally understood would have meant everything to me. 6 months earlier, I would have cried, wondered if things could still be fixed, wondered if we'd finally reached the breakthrough I'd been hoping for. But that woman didn't exist anymore. The woman sitting here now had already built a new life, a peaceful life, a life that didn't revolve around waiting for someone else to grow. Maya studied me for a long moment before smiling. You're really over him. I smiled back. I think so. The following week, Sophie called me unexpectedly. This time, I answered. Hi. She sounded happier than the last time we'd spoken. How are you? Good. I wanted to tell you something. Okay. Daniel and I set a new wedding date. I smiled. Congratulations. Thank you. There was a brief pause. Then Sophie added quietly. You know, he was right. Daniel, about everything. I wasn't surprised. What changed? I asked. Sophie laughed softly. Honestly, not much. What do you mean? We didn't stop being friends. Of course not. We just started acting like friends instead of emotional life partners. The honesty caught me off guard. Sophie continued. The crazy part is that once the boundaries were in place, everything became easier. I looked out the window. Healthy relationships usually are. I know that now. Another pause followed. Then Sophie spoke again. Ryan's not doing very well. I sighed. Sophie, I know. Her voice softened. I'm not asking you to do anything. Good. I just thought you should know. The truth was I already knew. Not because anyone told me. Because some regrets arrive slowly. They don't hit all at once. They build day after day, moment after moment. Every time someone else's words suddenly make sense. Every time a memory looks different in hindsight. Every time you realize the person who loved you most wasn't asking for much at all. Ryan wasn't suffering because I left. He was suffering because he finally understood why. And deep down, he knew something I had already accepted months ago. Understanding the lesson didn't mean getting another chance. Sometimes all it meant was learning exactly how much your mistake had cost. Chapter 5. Nearly a year after our breakup, Ryan sent me an email, not a text, not a phone call, an email. Somehow that alone told me how much he had changed. The old Ryan would have pushed. He would have insisted on talking things through. He would have shown up at my apartment, convinced that if he explained himself well enough, everything could be fixed. The email contained only 3 sentences. Emma, I know I don't deserve your time. I'm not asking for another chance. I just want to apologize properly. If you're willing to meet once, I'll be grateful. If not, I understand. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I closed it without responding. 3 days later, I opened it again. Not because I was considering reconciliation. That possibility had disappeared months ago, but because something about the message felt different. For the first time, Ryan wasn't trying to convince me I was wrong. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't asking me to understand him. He was simply asking for a conversation. In the end, curiosity won. We agreed to meet at a small cafe on a Sunday afternoon. When I arrived, Ryan was already there. The first thing I noticed was that he looked older. Not physically, emotionally, as if the past year had forced him to grow in ways he never expected. He stood when he saw me. Hi, Emma. Hi. We sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan smiled faintly. You look happy. I am. The answer seemed to please him and hurt him at the same time. I'm glad. Another silence followed. Unlike before, it wasn't uncomfortable. It simply felt like 2 people sitting with the reality of what had happened. Eventually, Ryan took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. I waited, not for cheating. His voice was steady because I never cheated. I know, and not because Sophie and I were secretly in love. I know that too. He nodded slowly. I finally understand that neither of those things mattered. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope, not longing, just acknowledgement. Because he really did understand now. Ryan looked down at his hands. You know what the worst part is? What? You explained it perfectly. A sad smile touched my lips. I tried. He laughed softly. You did. His eyes lifted to mine. You told me exactly what was wrong. Over and over. I remained silent. Ryan shook his head. I spent 3 years arguing with your feelings instead of listening to them. Yes. And every time you brought up a concern, I treated it like an accusation. Yes. I thought if I proved I wasn't cheating, the conversation was over. Exactly. He let out a long breath. God, I was an idiot. I didn't disagree. Ryan gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. Daniel did. By the way, did what? Disagree. That surprised me. Really, he said. Idiot was too generous. I laughed despite myself. Ryan smiled. Apparently, I needed consequences before I was willing to learn. The smile faded. Unfortunately, the consequence was losing you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan continued. Do you know what finally made me understand? I shook my head. The wedding invitations. I blinked. The invitations. Sophie's wedding. He laughed quietly. She picked them with Daniel. Understanding dawned immediately. Ryan nodded. It sounds ridiculous. No. I remember finding out afterward and feeling hurt. His expression turned thoughtful. Not angry, just hurt. I listened carefully, and then I realized that's what you've been trying to explain all along. He looked at me steadily. It wasn't about the invitations. I smiled faintly. No, it was about being considered. Yes. Being prioritized. Yes. Being chosen. This time I didn't answer because that had always been the heart of it. Ryan looked away briefly. For years, Sophie automatically included me in everything. His voice softened. Then she stopped. He laughed bitterly. I remembered what Sophie had told me. The boundaries, the changes, the healthier dynamic. Ryan rubbed a hand across his face, and every time I felt disappointed, I remembered you. Neither of us spoke. Every single time his voice grew quieter. Every time I felt left out. Every time I felt less important. Every time I wasn't someone's first call anymore. He swallowed hard. I finally understood what I've been asking you to tolerate. A strange sadness settled between us. Not because I still loved him, but because I remembered how badly I had wanted this realization from him. There had been a time when hearing these words would have meant everything. Ryan looked at me. You know what hurts most? I already knew the answer. What? You weren't asking for much. He laughed once without humor. That's the part one hate. I smiled sadly. I know you weren't asking me to choose between you and Sophie. No, you weren't asking me to end the friendship. No, you weren't asking for anything unreasonable. His eyes lowered. You were asking me to protect our relationship. Yes, the word hung softly in the air. Ryan nodded slowly, and I couldn't even do that. For the first time, I saw genuine regret. Not regret that he got caught. Not regret that he suffered consequences. Regret because he finally understood the pain he caused. Regret because he knew it had been avoidable. Regret because he knew I had given him every opportunity to prevent it. After a while, Ryan smiled sadly. Daniel and Sophie are getting married next month. I heard. I'm happy for them. Good. They fixed things. His eyes met mine. I wish we had too. I looked at him quietly. Then I spoke the truth. We couldn't have. He frowned slightly. Why? I thought about it for a moment. Because relationships don't fail because of one mistake. His expression softened. No, they fail because one person keeps pointing at the problem while the other person keeps pretending it isn't there. Ryan lowered his eyes because he knew exactly which person he had been. Several seconds passed. Then he looked up again. Can I ask you one question? Okay, if I'd understood sooner. His voice caught slightly. Would things have been different? The question didn't surprise me. In some ways, it had been waiting between us the entire conversation. I considered it carefully. Then I answered honestly. Maybe. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. The answer hurt. I could see it because maybe was far worse than no. No would have meant there was never a chance. Maybe meant there had been one once long ago. Before all the dismissals. Before all the excuses. Before all the times he chose comfort over growth. Ryan nodded slowly. That's fair. We sat quietly for another few minutes. Then I stood. Ryan stood too. Neither of us reached for the past. Neither of us tried to rewrite what had happened. Some stories weren't meant to be repaired, only understood. Take care of yourself. Ryan, you too. Emma. Then I turned and walked away. This time when I left him behind, there was no anger, no hurt, no unfinished conversation, just acceptance. And behind me, for the first time, Ryan finally understood that losing me had never been about Sophie. It had been about all the times I asked to be chosen, and all the times he assumed I would stay, even when I wasn't. Chapter 6. A month later, Sophie and Daniel got married. The wedding was beautiful, simple, and full of the kind of quiet happiness that comes from two people choosing each other every day. I almost didn't go. Sophie and I had never been especially close, and after everything that had happened, attending felt a little strange, but she had personally called me to invite me, and after some thought, I decided to go, not for Ryan, not for closure, just because life had moved on, and so had I. The ceremony took place at a vineyard overlooking a lake. Ironically, it wasn't very different from the kind of places Ryan and Sophie used to visit together every summer. As I sat among the guests, watching everyone take their seats, I found myself smiling. A year ago, I would have looked at this wedding and felt bitter. A year ago, I might have wondered whether Ryan and I would have reached this point eventually, whether we would have gotten married, whether things could have been different. Now, I simply felt happy for them. That's how I knew I was truly healed. Not because I had forgotten the past, because I no longer wanted to change it. The music began, and everyone stood. Daniel was waiting at the altar. His expressions softened the moment he saw Sophie appear at the end of the aisle. It was such a small thing, but it immediately reminded me of something. Priority. Not grand gestures, not dramatic sacrifices, just certainty. The certainty of knowing exactly who came first. Daniel looked at Sophie like there had never been any question. And perhaps that was what healthy love looked like. Not louder, not more passionate, just clearer. As Sophie walked toward him, I caught sight of Ryan sitting several rows ahead. He was alone. His gaze remained fixed on the couple at the altar. There was no bitterness on his face, no jealousy, just understanding. During the reception, I spoke with a few mutual friends, congratulated Sophie, danced once with Maya, and enjoyed myself far more than I expected. At one point, Sophie found me near the edge of the garden overlooking the lake. She looked radiant, happy, peaceful. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." She hesitated briefly. "Can I tell you something?" I smiled. "You're the bride. I don't think anyone can stop you." She laughed. Then her expression grew serious. "Daniel and I almost didn't make it." I wasn't surprised. "I know." She looked toward the reception hall, where Daniel was talking to several relatives. "I used to think boundaries were what people created when they didn't trust each other." Her voice softened. "Turns out boundaries are what make trust possible." I nodded. "That's usually how it works." Sophie smiled sadly. "I wish I understood that sooner." There was no point discussing regrets anymore. We had all made our choices. Some people simply paid higher prices for them than others. After a while, Sophie returned to the celebration. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, enjoying the evening air. That's when Ryan approached. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled politely. "Hi, hi." The interaction felt surprisingly normal. Two people who shared a history, but no longer carried it around with them. Ryan looked toward the lake. "Funny, isn't it? What? A year ago, I thought Daniel was overreacting." I laughed softly, and now, he shook his head. "Now I think he was the smartest person in the room." That made me laugh again. Ryan smiled. He saved his relationship. His gaze remained fixed on the water. I didn't save mine. I studied him quietly. There was still sadness there. I suspected there always would be. Some losses stayed with you. Not because you couldn't move on, because they changed you. Ryan glanced at me. "You seem happy." "I am good." He smiled, and this time, I believed he meant it. There was no hidden hope behind the words, no expectation, just sincerity. "What about you?" I asked. Ryan considered the question. "I'm getting there." I nodded. That was probably the best answer he could give. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. One he'd started much later than I had. Music drifted from the reception hall. Guests were gathering for the first dance. Ryan looked toward the lights and laughter inside. "You know," he said quietly, "for a long time, I thought losing you was the worst thing that happened to me." I didn't respond. "Now, I think not understanding you is worse." His voice carried no self-pity, only honesty, because I had someone who loved me enough to tell me the truth. He smiled faintly, and I kept arguing with her. I looked away toward the lake. A year ago, those words would have broken my heart. Today, they simply felt true. Ryan let out a slow breath. Anyway, he straightened slightly. "I should stop being dramatic at somebody else's wedding." I laughed. "Probably. Take care, Emma. You, too." Then, he walked back toward the reception. I watched him go for a moment before turning back toward the water. The sun had almost completely disappeared below the horizon, leaving streaks of gold across the lake. Behind me, music and laughter filled the evening. Ahead of me was a future I hadn't planned, but one I welcomed anyway. And for the first time, I realized something important. Ryan had spent the past year learning how to live with regret. I had spent the past year learning how to live without it. That was the real difference between us now. We had both moved forward, but only one of us had done so with peace. As the first stars appeared overhead, I smiled and headed back toward the celebration, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Behind me, Chapter 7. 3 months after Sophie and Daniel's wedding, I met someone, not in a dramatic movie-worthy way. No coffee spilled across a shirt. No accidental collision on a crowded street. No immediate fireworks. I met him because Maya was tired of hearing me claim I was perfectly happy alone and decided that meant I needed to attend a charity fundraiser with her. His name was Ethan. He was kind, thoughtful, and refreshingly straightforward. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't that he was handsome, although he was. It was that he listened, actually listened. When he asked a question, he cared about the answer. When I spoke, he paid attention. It felt strange at first. After spending years explaining myself, I had forgotten what it felt like to be understood without having to argue for it. We started slowly. A few dinners, a few walks, a few conversations that lasted longer than either of us intended. There were no grand declarations, no rushing, no pressure, just two adults getting to know each other. One evening, several months into dating, we were having dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the river when Ethan asked a question. "Can I ask you something?" I smiled. "You just did." He rolled his eyes. "You know what I mean. Go ahead." He hesitated briefly. "Why did your last relationship end?" The question didn't surprise me. Eventually, everyone asks. I set down my glass. We wanted different things. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Different things. Different priorities. He waited, giving me space to continue if I wanted. I appreciated that. No pushing, no assumptions, just patience. He had a female best friend. I said, and the friendship wasn't the problem. Ethan leaned back slightly. The boundaries were I laughed softly. That was faster than it took my ex to figure it out. Ethan smiled. People can be friends with whoever they want. Exactly. But relationships require room to grow. I stared at him for a moment. That's pretty much what I spent 3 years trying to explain. He shrugged. Seems obvious. The simplicity of the answer nearly made me laugh because it was obvious. That had always been the tragedy. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know what I think." "What?" "I think you're lucky," and ended. I raised an eyebrow. "That's a terrible thing to say." "Is it?" His smile softened. "If someone has to lose you before they learn how to value you, they weren't ready for you in the first place." For a moment, I couldn't think of a response. Not because it was romantic, because it was true. Across town, Ryan was also moving forward. At least he was trying to. He had changed a lot over the past year. Friends noticed it. Sophie noticed it. Even Daniel noticed it. He listened more, reflected more, defended himself less. The growth was real. Unfortunately, growth doesn't erase consequences. One afternoon, several weeks later, Ryan ran into Maya while grabbing coffee. According to Maya, the encounter was awkward for approximately 30 seconds before becoming surprisingly pleasant. They talked for a few minutes, caught up, exchanged polite conversation. Then Ryan asked the question Maya had been expecting. "How's Emma?" Maya told me about it afterward while trying very hard not to look amused. "And what did you say?" "I asked that you're doing great." "Good answer." Then he asked if you were seeing anyone. I groaned. "Maya, what?" he asked, and Maya grinned. I told him yes. I closed my eyes. "Please tell me you didn't enjoy that." "I enjoyed it a little." "You're horrible." "I know." Then her smile softened. "You know what he said?" I shook my head. He said, "Good." That surprised me. Maya nodded. Not in a fake way, either. She leaned back in her chair, more like sad acceptance. For a moment, I looked out the window. Somehow that sounded exactly right, because Ryan wasn't the same man anymore. The old Ryan would have focused on what he lost. The new Ryan understood why he lost it. Later that evening, Sophie called me. We still weren't close friends, but over time, we developed something unexpected. Respect. "I heard you're dating someone." I laughed. News travels fast. Ryan isn't the only person Maya talks to. Fair point. Sophie sounded genuinely happy. "How is he?" "Good, good, good." Or polite. "Good." I smiled. "Good, good. I'm glad." A brief silence followed. Then Sophie spoke, more quietly. "You deserve that." The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. "Thank you." "No." She laughed softly. "I mean it." I could hear Daniel in the background asking her something. She answered him before returning to the call. The small interaction made me smile. Once upon a time, she probably would have ignored him to finish the conversation with Ryan. Funny how much could change in 2 years. Before hanging up, Sophie said something that stayed with me. "You know, for a long time, I thought this story was about Ryan learning a lesson. And now I think it was about you." I frowned slightly. "Me?" "Yeah." Her voice softened. "Because you were the only person who did the right thing from the beginning." After the call ended, I thought about her words. Maybe she was right. Ryan learned. Sophie learned. Daniel enforced boundaries. Everyone eventually grew. But none of that happened until after consequences arrived. I was the only one who saw the problem and acted before someone else forced me to. Not because I was smarter, not because I was stronger, because I finally respected myself enough to leave when staying stopped making sense. Later that night, Ethan called. We talked about nothing important: work, weekend plans, a movie neither of us had finished. Before hanging up, he said, "I'll see you tomorrow." Such a simple sentence. Yet, it filled me with a quiet warmth. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was easy. Healthy love, I had learned, wasn't exhausting. It didn't require endless explanations. It didn't demand that one person constantly accept what the other refused to examine. It felt safe, clear, steady. As I set my phone down and turned off the light, I realized there was one final difference between Ryan and me. Ryan spent years learning how to stop taking love for granted. I spent those same years learning that love alone isn't enough. Respect matters, boundaries matter, being chosen matters, and once you understand that, you stop begging people to see your worth. You simply walk away from those who don't. The moment I learned that lesson wasn't the day Ryan finally understood me. It was the day I left him behind. And that, more than anything else, was why I never looked back. Epilogue. 1 year later, I stood on a balcony overlooking a garden filled with white lights and summer flowers. Laughter drifted through the evening air. Music played softly in the background. Below me, guests mingled across the lawn while servers carried trays of champagne and desserts. Sophie and Daniel were celebrating their first wedding anniversary. A year ago, I had attended their wedding. Now I was attending a celebration of the life they had built since then. And looking around, I couldn't help smiling. They were happy, not perfect, not effortless, just happy. The kind of happiness that comes from choosing each other every day. The kind that had nearly slipped through their fingers before they learned what mattered. A pair of arms wrapped around my waist from behind. You disappeared. I smiled. I was enjoying the view. Ethan rested his chin lightly on my shoulder. "Leah, excuse me, you were overthinking." I laughed. Maybe a little. "See, fine. Maybe I was." About what? I looked out at the lights below. Nothing important. That wasn't entirely true. I had been thinking about the past. Not because it still hurt, because it no longer did. Sometimes I still found it strange how much life could change in 2 years. Once upon a time, I had been convinced losing Ryan would be the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now I understood that staying would have been worse. "Emma." I glanced down. Ethan was holding out a small velvet box. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then my eyes widened. "Oh, that's not exactly the reaction I was hoping for." I laughed so hard I nearly cried. "Sorry, would shock be a bad sign? Only if I say no." His expression brightened. "So that's not a no. Ethan, right." He took a deep breath. Then he dropped a warm knee. The world around us seemed to fade. Not because everyone stopped moving, because for one brief moment, none of it mattered. Only him, only us, only the future waiting ahead. "Emma Carter," he said, smiling nervously, "you are the easiest person I've ever loved." My eyes immediately filled with tears. "You make my life better every day." He opened the ring box. "You make hard things feel manageable." I laughed through my tears. "You make ordinary days feel special." "Ethan, and I would really appreciate it if you'd let me finish before I completely forget my speech." That made me laugh again. He smiled. "I love you. Simple, clear, certain. I choose you every day." The words hit me harder than anything else because that had always been what I wanted. Not perfection, not grand gestures, not promises, just certainty, just being chosen. "Will you marry me?" I didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "Yes." His entire face lit up. "Yeah, yes." He stood, slipped the ring onto my finger, and kissed me. When we finally pulled apart, applause erupted below us. Apparently, we had acquired an audience. "Great," I muttered. "Now everyone knows." Ethan laughed. That was kind of the goal. A few moments later, Sophie came running up the stairs. "Oh my God." She immediately threw her arms around me. Daniel followed behind her, looking far calmer. "Congratulations," he said, Thank you. Sophie grabbed my hand to admire the ring. It's beautiful. I know. Ethan looked entirely too pleased with himself. As everyone celebrated around us, I noticed someone standing near the edge of the garden. Ryan. He had been invited. Of course. He and Sophie were still friends. Healthy friends. Normal friends. The kind they should have been years ago. For a moment, our eyes met. Then he smiled, and I smiled back. No awkwardness. No regret. No lingering pain. Just two people who had once loved each other and eventually become strangers again. Ryan raised his glass, slightly in my direction. A silent congratulations. I returned the gesture. Then Ethan slipped his hand into mine. And just like that, my attention shifted back to where it belonged. Forward, not backward. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, I found myself standing beneath the stars. The engagement rings sparkled whenever it caught the light. Ethan joined me a moment later. Happy. I looked at him, then at the celebration behind us, then at the future stretching ahead. Yes, the answer came easily, without hesitation, without doubt, because happiness wasn't something I had found. It was something I had chosen. The same way I had chosen to leave when staying no longer respected who I was. The same way Ethan chose me. The same way healthy love always worked. Choice, respect, trust, partnership. The things I once thought were too much to ask for. The things that had been worth waiting for all along. As Ethan wrapped an arm around my shoulders, I rested my head against him and looked up at the stars. Somewhere behind me, music drifted across the garden. Ahead of me was a future I couldn't fully see yet. But for once, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all. The right person doesn't make you compete for your place in their life. They make sure you never have to question it. And with that thought, I smiled, slipped my hand into Ethan's, and walked forward without looking.